Welcome to part 2 of social organization and cultural anthropology. This section will be about politics and how cultures have created different ways of either controlling power, using power, and also structuring, keeping order in society. So just a little recap from last lecture. We talked about subsistence strategies, how people get food, and how this usually lines up with the socio-political typologies of each society. So we talked about band, we talked about tribe, chieftain, and state, and how as groups of people begin creating a surplus, they tend to move through these different political categories. This lecture will go deeper into what those actually mean and the role of the individual in each of these societies. And we'll talk about how as we move towards the right here, societies become more socially stratified, meaning that they have less access to resources, well, less equal access to resources, and less equal access to status and power. So before we get a little deeper into this, I'd like to talk about the foundations of social organizational studies in the social sciences. The first person to really study this would have been Emil Durkheim, sociologist Emil Durkheim. He was a functionalist, and he believed that societies were organized the way they were because of the way we divided up labor. So I talked earlier in the lecture before about gender division of labor in tribal societies, and hence, since the division of labor is done through genders, and it's also done within each family unit and in their house, these societies tend to be structured through more of a kin-based network. And he believed that this division of labor is what makes a society work, or as he said, function, hence the idea of functionalism. So Emil Durkheim is a functionalism. That was one early way of looking at social organization and societies and categorizing them based on how they function, or based on the institutions they had and the results of their functions. The other major theoretical framework, or I should just say paradigm, overarching paradigm, is the idea of conflict. So other researchers, such as Karl Marx and Max Weber, are more interested in how societies get created because there seems to be a conflict over resources, or usually surplus. And this is the underlying factor of organizing a society. Weber and Marx believe that social institutions are a creation of relations to the extra things that are made. So in an economy and a society, you start making things, and as you begin making more things, social institutions are created to figure out how to control that, and then that feeds right back into reinforcing those social institutions. And Weber believed there were three main concepts that connected you to these social institutions. And those are social class, party class, and status class. Now, party class is politics. So the amount of time you have to participate in politics and the experience you have, the education, that is your power. Status class is prestige. So the achievements you've made, things you've done that are well respected in society, or possibly the person you were born to. And then finally your social class, which is your wealth. The access you have to the resources or the surplus of a society. Power is simply compelling people to do certain things. So power is the ability for you to be able to get someone else to do something. And politics is using that power to affect society, to affect the way that social institutions function, and to help structure them. One of the preeminent philosophers of power, the idea of power, was Michel Foucault. He was a 20th century philosopher. And he came up with many ideas about power relations between people. how we all have power between us, and really, we don't make power. It flows always between us. And all we can do is control it. All we can do is make sure that it doesn't hurt us, or we can try to make it influence other people. There's two main types of power. The first type of power is persuasive power. So this is the kind of power that politicians would use. This is the kind of power that marketing groups use. This is the kind of power that social activists use. And what this means is you are making people do what you want, or changing their ideas through just talking, or convincing them that you're right, or letting them connect to an ideology. Ruling through persuasive power is called hegemony. Hegemony is using that persuasive ability to actually keep people under control, to get them to do what you want, and to keep them in line, basically. It's hegemony. Coercive power is the other kind of power. Coercive power is getting people to do things through force. So threatening people with injury, or having them as prisoners or slaves. This is coercive power. And ruling through coercive power is domination. So the two main ways to rule are either through domination or through hegemony. And these are also the two ways to think about keeping society functioning properly. So Weber talked about power, and then he talked about status. He talked about status class. So first was party. This is whether you can be able to convince people to do certain things, either through domination or hegemony. And then we have status. Status are the things in society that are considered good about you, and they're non-economical. There's two main types of status. So these two pictures here are a couple local wealthy elites in Grand Rapids, and they both have fairly high status. On the right, you have Richard DeVos, the founder of Amway, and his status is what we call achieved status. It was gained through something he did through his life that was considered positive in society. So in his case, he started a company and became wealthy. On the left side here, we have his son, Dick DeVos. Dick DeVos, his status came mainly just from being born by Richard DeVos. So that kind of status we call ascribed status. You're already born with it. You don't have to achieve it. So thinking about status, thinking about conflict, thinking about function, thinking about power and how politics work, we're going to look at the four main types of socio-political typologies in anthropology. Here we are back to the band, tribe, chieftain, and state. And within these bands, tribes, chieftains, and states, we move from what's known as egalitarian, where everyone has equal access to resources, but they may not all have equal status. So they may not all have that party section. They may not have the same status within that party section that Weber talked about. Bands and tribes tend to be more egalitarian. They have leaders with higher status. However, access to resources is pretty equal. And at the same time, a lot of the decision making is actually pretty equal. Status does not necessarily mean that you rule in these societies. And as we move toward the state, the power and access to resources begins to be funneled up to an elite or a ruling class. So within chiefdoms, a ruling class took a hold of that surplus that Marx and Durkheim talk about, and they begin to rule over the people that don't have as much access to those resources. and this is called stratification. And finally, when you get to the state, we are totally stratified, and we have groups of people. There's unequal access to resources, and there's unequal access to status or power. There's unequal access to prestige, to politics, and to wealth. So within bands and tribes, within these egalitarian societies, as I've mentioned before, the division of labor is based on gender and also on kinship. This is a picture of the Yanomami Indians splitting up an animal after they had gone out hunting. So everyone in the community would have equal access to the meat. Durkheim considered these societies to be bound together with what is called mechanical solidarity. So what he meant by this was everyone does pretty much the same job. And I mean, there is division, but all the men pretty much do the same thing, and all the women pretty much do the same thing. And they're bound together by having the same jobs. Now, in egalitarian societies, there is unequal access to status. Within these societies, a lot of times there are groups that have a higher status than other groups. One of these in Native Americans were the sodalities. So the sodalities were cross-tribal within the Cheyenne Nation. And they were what they called legions. They were warriors that were part of this elite club that was between different tribes. And they had a higher status than anyone else. Another type of status-defined organization would be what are known as secret societies. Secret societies were in a lot of tribes. A great example of this is the Hopi of the Southwest. They have a room they call the kiva that only men could go into, and once a year or twice a year that they would dress as what were known as kachina, and the kachina would go out into the village and basically scare the kids. Nobody knew who they were, and then when you get to a certain age and you become part of the kachina, or you're allowed into the kiva, you learn that these kachina dancers are your aunts, your uncles, and your dad, and you become part of that, and you become part of this secret society that has a higher status than everyone else in the community. So you can become prestigious either through kinship or through achievement in egalitarian society. Another type of role that people have in tribal societies are known as age sets. So this is social status that's based on how old you are. So a lot of societies, a lot of cultures, especially a lot of African cultures, they don't really have birthdays. What they have is you are part of an age set. So you're part of a group of people that are around the same age as you, and you all go through the same rites of passages together as a group. Now, this is not the same as like what we would consider to be a generation or a cohort. That is what's called an age grade. An age set is much more prestigious. There's much more status attached to the age set. A popular example of the age set is the Maasai of Kenya. When you're young boys in Maasai, you and other boys around your age are part of the same age set.
Because you were all circumcised together.
And every 15 years or so, they have a ceremony. And during this ceremony, you become initiated into what is known as a Moran, a warrior. And while you're this warrior, you were the highest status in the community. The warriors protect the community, they have enforce rules in the community. Basically, they are at the height of their life. When a new Moran group comes in, you become an elder, marry a wife, you get a flock of sheep or cattle, and then you are considered a sage, considered an elder that the Moran can go to for help. This is a short movie about the Moran ceremony in Kenya.
Moving on, the Maasai Otto ceremony marks the end of one's age-set period of active junior warhood and also marks the promotion to junior elders or senior warriors. Now, our Kisii correspondent, Fred Moturi, brings you the details of this colorful event.
The ceremony entitles the Moran to take wives and raise families, although for the married group it also marks the end of their junior life, making them decision makers of matters affecting the whole community. It is truly a ceremony full of color, attended by the young and old from the Uasin Gishu clan in Transmara, one that occurs only once every 10 to 15 years. The Maasai graduating warriors are dressed in a red cloth, wrapped around their waist or sometimes slung across the shoulders. In one hand they hold a long stick referred to as ilum. They have bald heads on which a mixture of ochre and fat has been applied in a systematic way. The age set is a unique social structure in which Maasai of a similar age are grouped together.
Kwa mila ya Kimasai tuko na rika. Kila rika ni watu maybe range yao ya miaka ni kama wametofautiana labda kuanzia miaka 5 mpaka 10.
Women automatically assume membership of the age set of their husbands.
Hao wake ambao umeona wakishiriki ni wake wetu. Kila mwanaume leo ama kila morani anakuja na mke wake.
The age set thus formed is a permanent grouping, lasting throughout the life of its members.
Yani tumefuka kutoka ngazi ya utoto, sasa ni watu wazima. Mzee amekuwa mzee, sasa si kijana tena. Na mimi pia sasa ni mama, manake mimi ni mke wake, hawezi kuwa mzee na mimi nibaki msichana.
But before this ceremony is performed, boys and men between the ages of 12 and 25 are separated from the previous age set and go through a morata, a circumcision rite of passage, and they must remain in black attire for between 4 and 8 months. These young men will live in a manyata built by their mothers. Warriors perform the jumping dance referred to as adumu. This dance helps determine a warrior by testing their strength and endurance, and of course to impress young girls or their girlfriends referred to as intoye. As per the tradition, all the songs consist of rhythms, while an oloronyani, the song leader, sings the melody, and the chorus is provided by vocalists singing while emphasizing on a subject matter, and the song is repeated word for word as it progresses. However, the culture has some change, and the Morans no longer spend their days beyond the boundaries, wandering Maasai lands or engaging in cattle stealing.
That is the clear cut between us, that we support those cultural practices which are not retrogressive, which do not impact negatively on education and our tradition.
Even though we are digital, but our culture is more than digital.
What remains for these Morans is to observe strict discipline.
Wanafunza watu usikuwe muisi, usikuwe mtu mubaya, to be united as Kenyans. Ndio Wamasai waliweka hiyo rule. Ndio unaona hata sasa tuko na rungu na tuko na kisu, lakini hakuna siku tutatumia kupika mtu.
After the dance, the entire group of about 3,000 men walked around 500 meters to the new site for oath taking. Indeed, it was a colorful ceremony that showed a unique way of preserving a beautiful culture. Fred Moturi, KTN in Transmara.
So egalitarian societies are many times called acephalous, and what this means is that it's without a head. The decisions that they make are not made in the same way that a chiefdom or a state would be made. Every decision comes through what's known as consensus. They get together, they have a council, and when they have this council, they make decisions. And these decisions, more often than not, have to be a complete consensus of everyone that's in the council. So up here in the upper left-hand corner, we have an example of the Zapatistas, who are indigenous people in southern Mexico who have created an autonomous state within Mexico through revolution, and they make all their decisions through consensus, which can be really frustrating for the government because they still consider themselves Mexican. And when government officials come down and try to negotiate with them, they find that it can take months before they get a decision because they will begin negotiating, and then this council that they're negotiating with will go out to all the other villages and ask the other councils how they feel about it, and an answer can take a very long time. Native Americans operate this way. Other tribal groups around the world have operated this way for thousands of years, actually. There are leaders, however, even though decisions are made in consensus. Shagnon hung out with what was called a headman of the Yanomama. The headman gets what he gains this status by doing certain things, by proving himself in society. Now, this is not the same as a chief, so there's been confusion when Europeans first came. They would say, "Hey, bring me to your chief, to your leader," and they bring him to the headman. They talk to the headman, and then they say, "Well, the headman told me we can do that," but headmen can't make decisions. Headmen they talk with the outside world. They're a mouthpiece of the tribe, and at the same time, they're used for their wisdom within the community. But decisions are almost always made through consensus. Another type of leader in tribal societies is a big man. In Papua New Guinea, this is very common. To be a big man, you have to give away things. You have to give away a lot of things. In their case, it's pigs. This is a movie called, just a clip out of a movie called
Anka's Big Maka.
It's about a headman in Papua New Guinea and the things that he has to go through to be able to achieve the status of being a big
man. The most prominent leader, or big man, of the Khalkha tribe is Anka. For 5 years, the Khalkha tribe, driven on by Anka, have been struggling to assemble a huge gift, mainly of pigs, to present to a neighboring tribe. For Anka, assembling and giving this gift is more important than anything in his life. This film is about why Anka so wanted to do it, and about his efforts to bring it off. The big man of the tribe who are going to receive the gift is Perewa, who is also the local member of the National Assembly. One day, this July, Perewa set off on his way back home to the highlands. Perewa knew pretty well what the Khalkha were trying to prepare. 500 or 600 pigs, rare birds, money, tubes of decorating oil, a truck, and maybe a motorbike. All his life, Perewa, like all highland men, has been involved in the system of receiving gifts and later repaying them. These gifts are called moka, and moka is the most important thing in the lives of the highland people. When he got home this summer, Perewa thought that Anka's moka was going to be very soon, but that's not how it turned out, and Perewa just had to wait till Anka was ready. Early this summer, after years of scheming and manipulating, planning and persuading, Anka began to feel that he might finally be able to bring off his big moka, and that it could be the biggest moka ever given. The reason why Anka so wanted to give his big moka is that only by giving can he earn fame and status for his tribe and for himself. In the West, you can get status lots of ways, from money, from success, from your job, your possessions. The only way Onka can get status is to outdo his fellow men in Mocha, to overwhelm them publicly by the sheer size of the gift that he gives. It's an awful lot of work to organize a big gift, and Onka needed the cooperation of a lot of people. Big men have no authority over their tribesmen. Onka cannot order people around. He can only persuade. Onka gave them a favourite speech in which he told them to stop fiddling about in their gardens, to stop drinking beer and wasting time with women, and to get on with it. What you are supposed to be doing, he said, is getting pigs ready for the mocha, not sitting around eating them. The Kaolka are a small tribe, about 1,000 people. All around are other tribes, some allies, some enemies. There are no villages, just scattered settlements, around which Onka plodded, bringing news, checking on progress, and trying to set a date for the big mocha. The date is always a problem. Big men compete for the status of fixing the date, and a lot of conspiring goes on.
Finally, tribes can have nations. So we're part of a nation state, but you can be a tribal nation also. A nation is simply a group of people that share an ideology with one another and at the same time share a political structure with each other. You read an article called The Founding Indian Fathers. It talks about the Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois Confederacy was a nation of tribes in the United States, in the New York area, that were bound together by a constitutional committee, by a council. At the end of this lecture, you'll be watching a movie that talks about the Iroquois Confederacy and the influence that the Iroquois Confederacy actually had on our own Constitution of the United States. So now we're going to move into large-scale societies, the political organization of large-scale societies, of chiefdoms and of states. And what makes them different is they are stratified. There is unequal access to resources, status, and power. So there's unequal access to the three things that Weber talked about. So there's unequal access to social class, which is your access to resources, and unequal access in politics, which is your power, and unequal access to prestige or status. These societies are not bound together by a gender division or a gender division of labor. There's specialization in these societies. People do things. There are lots of different jobs that people do, and it's not necessarily based on your gender. It can sometimes be based on your kinship. A lot of times, certain trades will be passed down through generations. But everybody's doing a lot of different specializations show up in these societies. And Durkheim called this organic solidarity, where everyone's kind of an organ of the whole society doing their own thing to make the whole body work. The first type of this is the chiefdom. So the chiefdom is kin-based, and it's also a ranked society. So the distance you are familially or kin-wise from the leader, from the ruler, known as the paramount chief, is where you are placed within the hierarchy of society. So the closer you are to the chief, the more you will have access to prestige, to economics, and to power. There were multiple chiefdoms. There have been multiple chiefdoms throughout the world. The Hawaiian Islands were a chiefdom. The Vikings operated under chiefdoms, and currently some African societies still are structured through a chiefdom, but there were at one time a lot of chiefdoms in Africa. Paramount chief keeps power in the society through a shared ideology, just like a nation. Many times that ideology is that the chief is divine, he is a deity, or he is the son or daughter or the son of a deity. He also keeps control and power through redistributing wealth, redistributing surplus. We're going to talk about the Kwakiutl Indians when we talk about economics. We'll talk about the potlatch. And the potlatch is when a chief comes in and just gives a bunch of stuff away. Very similar to the way the big man does it. However, it's done in a way where the chief is not trying to gain any more status than he already has, but just showing the people that he cares about them. This is a movie about Cahokia, which was a Mississippian chieftain, one of the largest settlements the largest settlement in the United States prior to Columbus.
If only we could go back in time, we might unravel the mystery of this place. How it was planned, how it was built, what it meant to its people. Now we can see only hints of all that was Cahokia. A huge mound, the largest earthen monument in the Americas, and a vast series of smaller mounds arranged in patterns across the largest archaeological site north of Mexico. There is no other place like Cahokia. We're still learning its secrets, and they point to a far-reaching enterprise, to a people who had a vision for what they would build, and to a city like no other in its time. The valley was rich naturally abundant. Its fertile soil, laid down by the continent's mightiest river, was hospitable to a vast range of plant species. The river, its floodplain, and the nearby bluffs provided several different habitats for a wide variety of animals. It also became a habitat for human beings who migrated into the area over 12,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago, the people here evolved into a culture we call Mississippian. These were the men and women who built the mounds. Like earlier people, they grew squash, sunflowers, and other seed-bearing crops. Wild plants, fish, and other animals were also important food, but the fuel for their great enterprise was agriculture. When Mississippian communities started growing corn, for example, they could produce more food than they needed, a surplus. Corn grew well here. Crop yields were high. Because corn could be stored for long periods, some could be saved for years when crops were poor. With a steady food supply, great numbers of people could make Cahokia their permanent home. Mississippians could also exchange surplus crops for meat, tools, clothing, or other items. This meant some people didn't have to farm. They could specialize in other activities, such as tool making. So corn and other crops became more than food. They fueled a whole society. The leader might demand a share of corn to use for a variety of purposes. His emissaries might trade their community's surplus for rare and exotic goods, such as copper or seashells. Mississippian communities traded in this way over a network that spanned thousands of miles, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Ozarks. All of these communities were part of the Mississippian tradition. The larger ones built massive, flat-topped mounds, huge platforms of earth where temples or other buildings were erected. In the American Bottom region, where the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers converge, there was an even more closely linked network. Small communities, some consisting of just a few houses planted at the edge of a cornfield, were linked to larger villages, which were themselves linked to still larger communities, some with thousands of residents. At the center of them all was Cahokia. Cahokia, the great mounds, the vast ceremonial plazas, houses as far as the eye could see. Cahokia. It was the seat of power, of vitality, of wealth, of security. It prevailed for several hundred years. Cahokia. Its many parts were sited with great and deliberate precision. Each area had a function. There were enormous plazas for games, ceremonies, and great gatherings. There were miles of stockade wall protecting the central ceremonial area. There was a unique sun calendar that we call Woodhenge. There were fields of corn and other crops vast enough to feed up to 20,000 inhabitants and produce a surplus. There were immense pits, and from these earth for the mounds was dug. There were ridge-top mounds marking the city's boundaries. There were flat-top mounds where buildings stood, and there were conical burial mounds. And there was one mound, greater than all the others, greater than any other structure in the whole Mississippian world. This great platform of earth was at the center of the community. It was the highest point and the home of the chief. From here, he ruled the earth and spoke to the sky. His wealth was immeasurable, his wisdom profound, his authority unquestionable. The chief was responsible for maintaining balance between the spiritual forces of the upper world and the lower world. And perhaps even more challenging, he was responsible for maintaining order and harmony among the people. Service rendered to him was as to the gods. With his wisest advisors, the chief directed construction of the great mound, the site of his temple. For the thousands of laborers, building the mound was an act of loyalty and of faith. Building it in stages, they dug the earth with stone hoes and carried it on their backs in woven baskets, 50 to 60 pounds at a time, 15 million times over a 300-year period. They watched the great mound as it grew, and they were proud. Cahokia was a busy place, bustling with human energy. The people made and used tools and other objects. They obtained and prepared food. They built houses and other structures. They struggled with all the byproducts of urban life, such as crowding, garbage, crime. They raised children, nursed their sick, and buried their dead. As Cahokia grew in population, it also grew in complexity. A single-family group, which in an earlier time would have been able to provide for all its own needs, now had to trade and work with other clans and families to survive. Much as in our own society, relationships extended beyond the family to weave a web of interdependence within the community. For the people of Cahokia, each day was a challenge to the body, to the mind, and to the spirit. Like human beings everywhere and in every era, Mississippian people used their myths and beliefs to help them understand their world, its seen and unseen aspects, its known and unknown nature. We find clues to their beliefs in the rituals they performed and in the symbols they used. A seed is buried, like a friend who has passed away, and from it grows a new plant which ripens and is harvested so that the seed may be planted again. Death follows life, and life follows death. It is a cycle never-ending. Or consider the snake that lives under the earth and can be seen to emerge from its old dead skin wearing a fresh new one. Or witness the sun, the giver of fire and life, advancing across the heavens in a perfect, predictable arc. Use it to chart the seasons. Use it to mark the moment when day and night are equal. Use it to measure the cycles of life. Today, we look back at Cahokia with boundless curiosity. Every day, new scientific techniques, new technologies, and new ideas help us to understand the culture that ruled this valley for hundreds of years. But there are still many mysteries to unravel and many discoveries to be made. For example, no one knows exactly why Cahokia began to decline sometime late in the 13th or early in the 14th century. We know the end came slowly, over many years, as Cahokia's authority and power were challenged. We know poor nutrition and disease were growing problems. Maybe changes in climate, dwindling resources, and a growing population, or perhaps class warfare, conflicts within the group or from the outside also contributed to the decline. These mysteries endure, and they challenge us to think harder, to reach back with the power of imagination to a time long ago when embers, fed by the sacred fire, glowed and smoldered through the night.
In those days the earth was bountiful, and my people were many, and many fires warmed us. We planted
maize and prayed for blessings from the rain and the sun. We traveled far and returned with many fine things. We saw fine houses and great temples, but wherever we traveled, we sang proud songs
about the greatness of our home, because none we saw throughout the land could match the splendor and the majesty of this place. This place
where the maize grows tallest, where the runners are most swift, where the builders
reach the sky, and where the noble sun shines most brightly.
The Kocha wanted to send a prayer to the sun. So he called on his friend the bear, and the bear came and he said, "Oh, I'm very honored to be asked to do this, but I can only take it to the top of the highest tree. But I know someone who can. So let's call Eagle." And so Eagle was called, and Eagle said, "Yes, I can try." And so Eagle flew and flew and flew up, and got to the sun and delivered the prayer. And the sun was so taken with this, he said, "Give me one of your feathers." And so the eagle plucked out a tail feather and gave it to the sun, and the sun kissed that feather, which is why, eagle feathers are black on the end, and it's because the sun sends them there. He said, "Take this back, and forever this will be my recognition of my special people."
Along the Mississippi River, 6 miles from present-day St. Louis, Missouri, there stood a city that once dominated the heart of the continent. At its center was a powerful leader.
A great number of years ago, there appeared among us a man who came down from the sun. This man told us that he had seen from on high that we did not govern ourselves well, that we had no master, that each of us had presumption enough to think himself capable of governing others, while he could not even conduct himself.
1,000 years ago, the great sun, a leader who was both king and pope, lived atop a man-made royal mountain, 10 stories high. Its 16-acre base larger than any pyramid in Egypt.
He told us that in order to live in peace among ourselves, we must observe the following points. We must never kill anyone but in defense of our own lives. We must never know any woman besides our own. We must never take any things that belong to another. We must never lie, nor get drunk. We must not be avaricious. We must give generously and with joy, and share our subsistence with those who are in need of it.
From the heights of his royal estate, the great sun mediated between the Creator and the people, between the sun and the earth. This is Cahokia, city of the sun. The great sun ruled the thriving center of a vast Mississippian culture. Outside the walled city, communities of farmers, hunters, and fishermen stretched for miles, surrounded by fields of corn. With 20,000 residents, no city in the United States would surpass Cahokia's historic size before 1800. Only then would Philadelphia's population eclipse the ancient center.
These people lived in daub and wattle houses on top of the principal people did, the priest and the royalty. They lived in very substantial houses, not teepees. Not teepees. Teepees, Western Plains people. Down here they lived in houses. They were sedentary, they were farmers, they used the rivers and the bayous and the streams as not only for commerce, but for sustenance as well.
With the Mississippi and other major rivers as its highways, Cahokia was linked by trade to a third of the continent. Copper arrived from the Great Lakes, obsidian from Yellowstone, mica and crystal from the Appalachians, gold and silver from Canada, shell from the Gulf of Mexico.
Look at these old live oak trees that have seen so much pass by them. Magnificently dressed Indian people coming down that bayou in a dugout, greeting people, standing right here on this bank, having a good time, because they did. You know, Indian people have always known how to have a good time. And there would be a feast prepared. The women would put the corn together. They'd make sofki. They would roast a deer. The people would bring gifts. You never go to an Indian's house without bringing something that's as old as the sunrise.
Cahokia was the pinnacle of a mound-building culture with traditions dating back to before 1000 BC. Thousands of mounds still dot the landscape from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. An average funeral mound in the Ohio Valley was 3 stories tall. Construction could represent 200,000 man-hours of labor, or 100 men carrying the baskets of earth for a year. But few mounds compare with the religious effigy located 50 miles east of Cincinnati, Ohio, the Great Serpent Mound. The enormous snake stretches over 400 yards in length. While their earthworks are the mound builders' most visible legacy, their smaller creations are their most beautiful. Only glimpses remain of the people who changed the course of life on the northern continent. Most of their material world, wooden buildings, boats, baskets, woven textiles, leather footwear, and clothes, have long since turned to dust.
An old Caddo relative of mine said that I used to go outside and hold my hands up and bless myself with the sun, hot. Well, I can't do that anymore because they say we sun worshipers. That we didn't worship the sun. We worshiped what was behind it, the power behind it.
The point at which this place becomes a permanent residence for people for some period of time is about 1000 AD. The mounds that are associated here at the site have a multiplicity of uses. We know some of the mounds are used to cover the dead. Other mounds are basically what we call platform mounds, in which buildings were placed on top of them as they were being built. But one of the new discoveries is that in a number of cases, and maybe many cases, is that the initial creation of that mound was preceded by some kind of special building or some kind of special feature that are placed on that landscape, and then the building is abandoned, destroyed, or leveled, removed, whatever. But what they're doing is they're burying the building itself as an act of not only its death but also its renewal. So this process can repeat itself on multiple occasions, and in some cases many times, in other cases not so many times. So there's no specific one-fits-all category.
In this type of society, there's both gender roles and age roles that people fall into, and some of it depends on the particular maybe lineage or clan you belong to, what you're responsible for as part of the whole community. But there would be, jobs that women would do, and they would train their daughters to do that, and men would train the boys for things they were involved in. So probably mostly a lot of the agriculture, pottery making, weaving, hide cleaning, child rearing, be female-oriented jobs. Men would be involved in some of the heavier labor, hunting, fishing, and a variety of other tasks.
The excavations out at Mound 34 each summer include field schools, and so they are a big part of the excavations and provide a lot of our manpower, but it's also a very good place for them to learn how to excavate, because being nicknamed the trash mound, There are a lot of things to find. There are a lot of artifacts. Some of the things they found this year were marine shell beads. They found several arrowheads. They found pottery that was one piece of pottery that had an engraving of a fish on it. Other excavations have found drilled shark's teeth from the Gulf of Mexico, imitation shark's teeth made out of chert or flint, pieces of copper. So we really find lots of unusual and exciting things.
One of the activities taking place underneath what eventually where the Mound 34 was constructed was a copper workshop. It was characterized by a small central hearth, and then around that hearth they had excavated small pits, and that they would go back and forth between annealing the copper in the hearth and then hammering it out and thinning it out into sheets, which they were going to use later on.
Finally, we have the state. So within the state, access to resources and prestige and politics is definitely unequal. However, there are different kinds of states. The state is run by a centralized bureaucracy. And depending on how that centralized bureaucracy is put into place, access to the resources, prestige, and politics can either be closed. So the case of India, the case of ancient Egypt, they have caste systems, and within these caste systems you cannot move between different stratification levels. This is a scribe, you're born into these systems, and there's no movement. And the people on the top, the Brahmins, would be part of the bureaucracy that decides what happens within the state. In open systems, such as ours, you can have a scribe and a chief status. So you can be born into high status, and at the same time you can potentially achieve higher status, higher class. You can get more access to resources, more access to prestige, and more access to power. Within the state, you have the bureaucracy. So we tend to think of bureaucracy as a negative. Oh, there's lots of bureaucracy. But without bureaucracy, we would not have any sort of structure whatsoever within the state. It is the definition of the state. Without bureaucracy, you usually end up back at tyranny. Usually end up into a chiefdom, and within a chiefdom, there is never any chance of moving between different social class, because access to resources and prestige and power is always based on your status, or your ascribed status. So finally, we're going to watch a movie about the Iroquois Nation. The Iroquois Nation greatly influenced our Constitution. On the eagle of our country, just part of our ideology. This clutching these arrows here is very important, and is actually a concept that came out of the Iroquois Nation. And as you watch this video, and as you read the article, it's important to think about how important this group of people was to our current political system.
I would like to tell you a history story, one that is not written in the history books, nor is it being taught in the classrooms. But I think you will agree that it should be. It was long, long ago, in the days of our ancestors, there lived a man named Daganoweda, an Oneida holy man. And at that time, there were 5 nations living in the area. They were the Seneca, the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Oneida. And these nations were always fighting with each other. Many wars were being fought. Many lives were being lost. This greatly troubled Daganoweda, and he thought there must be a way to devise a system by which these nations could live together in peace, a secure and lasting peace. He thought and thought about this until he hit upon a plan, one he called the Great Plan of Peace. Then he began to travel among these nations, speaking with the people, sitting in council explaining his plan, forging alliances. The alliance was such that each tribe would maintain control over their own affairs, but they would come under a much larger treaty, one that stated, should anyone attack any one of these tribes, they would be attacking all of them. All major decisions would be made by the 5 nations sitting in council. The day-to-day decisions would be left to the individual tribes. And it was the women who would elect the men to council. This was part of the rule. And if the men did not do the job, the women would vote them out. And so these 5 nations came together and met at a place not far from what is today Syracuse, New York. And at that first meeting, over 50 chiefs gathered under a symbolic tree of peace and declared, "This is our alliance, and it is good." They became known as the Iroquois Confederacy, but they called themselves the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse. Now, many years later, Benjamin Franklin had heard of this alliance, and at that time the colonies were looking for a system by which they could work together. The problem was that each one of the colonies wanted to be in charge, but they knew they would have to come together to protect themselves from England. So in 1765, they met at the New Albany Convention, and Benjamin Franklin invited the Iroquois people to come to this convention to explain how their system worked. And they did. And the colonial representatives liked this system. And so that great plan of peace that Daganoweda started and brought democracy to this land 300 years before Columbus became the foundation for what is today the Constitution of the United States of America. In 1987, Senator Daniel Inouye brought this before the combined houses of Congress, and it is now written in the congressional record that this is the truth. The Constitution of the United States came from the Haudenosaunee people. This nation was founded on Indian principles.
As we leave the Longhouse through the western door, we're reminded of the Seneca's role in the Iroquois Confederacy. As keepers of the western door, visitors coming from the west who wanted to travel through Haudenosaunee territory had to be welcomed by the Seneca. In many ways, the Longhouse was both a place to live and a symbol of peace.
The Iroquois is actually a group of 6 different Indian nations. In the late 1500s, the Seneca, Mohawk, Cayuga, Oneida, and Onondaga nations joined together to form the Iroquois Confederacy, ending warfare between these nations. Then, in 1772, a 6th nation, the Tuscarora, moved into the region and joined the Iroquois Confederacy. Although the different nations lived in separate regions, the people of the Iroquois Confederacy thought of the land they shared as one giant longhouse. And just as families work together in a longhouse, the different nations also work together. The Senecas, who lived in the western end of the territory, were the keepers of the western door. The Mohawks, who lived in the eastern end, were the keepers of the eastern door. And the Onondagas were the keepers of the Central Council fire. After the Europeans arrived in New York in the 1700s, the Iroquois way of life was changed forever. Most of their land was taken by the Europeans after the French and Indian War, and then the colonists after the American Revolution. And they no longer lived in longhouses as their ancestors had for hundreds of years. Instead, they lived in log cabins similar to the European settlers. Today, thousands of Native Americans still live in New York, in towns and cities, and on reservations. And Native American names are still used throughout the state: Oneida, Cayuga, Tonawanda, Onondaga, Lake Erie, and Seneca Falls, to name a few. To the Iroquois people, the Longhouse has remained a powerful symbol of their culture, uniting them no matter where they live.
We call ourselves the Haudenosaunee, or the Haudenosaunee, meaning the people who are building a longhouse, the people that completed a house. That longhouse really is a symbol of the actual building that we used to live in, but it's also a metaphor for our way of life. And it also is a symbol of how we govern ourselves. 5 nations, 5 extended families living under one roof. That roof is the common law. We call it the Great Law.
So the Longhouse then became kind of the touchstone for all the Iroquois. This was the basic unit of their society. And so it was natural for them to seize upon that as the metaphor for the League of the Iroquois. So they imagined then that there was a great invisible longhouse that stretched across New York State from near what is now Albany to near what is now Rochester through the Finger Lakes area, with the ends of the longhouse being occupied conceptually by the Mohawks at the east end, the Senecas at the west, the Onondagas at the middle, and the other 2 nations of the League of the Iroquois, the Oneida and the Cayuga, being between them. So it's an interesting metaphor that they came up with that was based in their domestic architecture.
We start off with this lodge where the families are together, and slowly as the families grow, as other nations join us, the longhouse keeps extending. And ideally it extends from where the sun rises in the east to where it sets in the west. So it really is the symbol that through peace we will become united and strong.
One translation from the French explorer Samuel de Champlain in 1616 describes an Iroquois longhouse.
Their cabins are in the shape of tunnels or arbors and are covered with the bark of trees. They are from 25 to 30 fathoms long and 6 fathoms wide, having a passageway through the middle from 10 to 12 feet wide. On the sides there's a kind of bench 4 feet high, where they sleep in the summer in order to prevent the annoyance of fleas, of which there are great numbers. In the winter, they sleep on the ground on mats near the fire, so as to be warmer than they would be on the platform. They have pieces of wood suspended on which they put their clothes, provisions, and other things for fear of mice. In one of these houses there may be 12 fires and 24 families. It smokes excessively. There is no window, nor any other opening except in the upper part of their cabins for the smoke to escape.
It would typically be a house that would have a series of compartments, and somewhere in that house there'd be a senior female and her husband. And the other compartments were occupied by that woman's daughters, maybe her sisters, maybe her granddaughters, and the various men that had married into the family, who had moved to this longhouse from other longhouses.
The one thing about Haudenosaunee Village is everybody had a role to play, and very important roles. There was a balanced society. The men had work to do, the women had important work to do. In fact, the women were probably more involved in orchestrating the economy of the village, because they're out doing the planting and the crops, producing the clothes and producing the kitchenware and all of the utensils. The men are out in the woods gathering raw material, hunting, fishing, trapping. The best way to look at it is the domain of the men is out in the woods. The domain of the women is within the clearing where the village and the fields are. Now, the old people, or we would call elders, they also are the mentors for the young kids. They're there to teach them the finer details about things. But what we believe is that everybody's born with a certain gift. You have one, I have one, everybody has one. As soon as that gift becomes revealed, then you have to master that gift for the sake of the community. It's like you learn how to make a pot, but you're also hearing the stories about clay, how the first pot was made and what the designs mean. So as you're making these things, you're learning about the larger history. And that's where the old people would come in and tell you that history.
Iroquois women presided over all of the cultivation, along with help from the youngsters.
The method of growing the crops involved girdling the trees and letting the sun come into the forest during the heat of the summer. But the planting was a fairly easy task of simply using simple hoes to scrape up the soil of the forest, which is pretty loose. Forest stuff is easy to work with. Scrape that up into hills, and those small hills were then planted with sometimes all three, but sometimes just one or two of their main crops. So certainly they'd put some corn kernels in the hill. They might put in some beans, and they might put in some squash. Now these three plants work together in a beautiful sort of way, not just nutritionally later on after they were harvested, but also while they were growing. The beans could use the corn stalks like bean poles. So the corn stalks provide support for not just the corn itself, but also for the beans that are twining up the corn stalk. At the same time, the squash spread out on the ground between the hills and shaded the ground and suppressed other weeds that otherwise would have competed with the plants. So they've got all three of these things growing together.
Around the age of 10, the boys would begin traveling with their fathers instead of staying to help closer to the village with their mothers. These young men were extremely excited to be able to go on long hunting and fishing expeditions that might last for many days at a time.
The old longhouse lifestyle was very hard. You had to do a lot of work, but at the same time we had a lot of ways for the people to entertain themselves. One of them was lacrosse. Now, we believe lacrosse started right at the time of creation. The two creator twins that were wrestling for who's going to have domain over this land played lacrosse, and they played to a draw. So when we play lacrosse today, it's like we are reenacting that kind of great celestial battle for the domain. And we also believe that our ancestors pass and go back up to the sky world, that they play lacrosse up there. It's the Creator's favorite game. He just loves to see us play. And it was a way for the men to, kind of exercise themselves, relieve a lot of stress, and promote a friendly rivalry, we'll say.
I spent a lot of time engaged in ritual activity that was designed to reinforce the community. So you've got the Strawberry Festival. In the spring you've got the Thunderers, which is to welcome the thunderstorms of the spring. You have the green corn ceremony in, say, August, and then the harvest ceremony in the fall. And over again, what happens in these cyclical kinds of ceremonies is that there's a great deal of attention paid to the Thanksgiving address. The whole purpose of the Thanksgiving address is to recognize the indebtedness of human beings to the resources that are provided by nature.
The Iroquois were very thankful for what the Creator had given them. They were also incredibly resourceful, finding uses for the hide, such as clothing and bedding, as well as endless uses for bones and antlers.
They were smart about how they went out into the environment. They dressed warmly as they could. They would stuff their moccasins with moss in order to give them some insulation. They wore leggings, and they wore long cape-like cloaks of beaver pelts stitched together. Those are pretty warm. But nonetheless, if you're going to avoid frostbite, if you don't want to lose fingers in the bitter cold of the depth of winter, then you just stay inside until it blows over. Now that can be pretty rough if you have an extended period of snowfall and cold weather. You might find yourself starving, and the choice then is to either go out, try to find a deer, or to stay inside and starve to death. So it's a hard choice for folks in this environment. In the middle of the winter was a time when they would be making a lot of their tools, getting ready for the summer, carving things. A lot of artistic expression is the consequence of having time on your hands.
Men would come back to the village, and that's the time where stories are told, winter. And primarily because they said if you tell the stories in the spring and the summer, there's such great stories that all the animals get kind of lazy, and they gather around and listen to these stories, and they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. First of all, you know how drab the winters are here. You need these animated stories to enliven your spirit. So that's the time when you learn about what's going to happen. So it would be great storytelling time. The storyteller would come by, and usually they would carry this little bag full of goodies, and they'd reach in the bag and pull out something, maybe pull out a bear tooth. He says, this tooth reminds me of this great monster bear. I'm going to tell you about them. And the storyteller is kind of an animator. He brings that story alive. And so that was the way in which our people taught each other. The other thing, too, is you can imagine then our world, or our comprehension of the world, was gained through these stories. That's how we learned who we are and where we belong. Today, television has invaded our homes, and our kids are hearing everybody else's stories but ours. So it's no wonder that we're a little confused these days.
I think because originally the truth is that the Constitution does come from the Iroquois Confederacy. It does come, and the U.S. Congress acknowledged that not long ago, that it does indeed influenced by and you find out Franklin and Jefferson did go and spend at least 30 years before and learned the Mohawk jargon, the Mohegan jargon, all the Iroquois jargon of trade, and learned and sat with their councils and studied, and like, wow, these people had equality, men and women. And they said, how couldn't, and at that time there were a few million. It wasn't just 100,000 or so. There were millions of Native people across this land that lived the same way, the same principles. So it was not just the Iroquois, but the Constitution was in this part in Philadelphia in the Northeast. So that's where they talk about. In fact, Jake Swamp and Tom Porter, who are traditional chiefs this day of the Iroquois Confederacy, have those stories that are not written into history books. They may be referenced, but when the Iroquois chiefs were asked to come to the Freedom Hall, Independence Hall in Philadelphia, they were put upstairs. And whenever the Continental Congress had deliberations, they would go upstairs and ask the Native people, what did you do when you got to this part? And the thing that we don't hear is that these chiefs were locked into the upstairs. They were only brought food and questions. And we don't hear the other part of, how the founding fathers actually excluded the Native people. Well, that's a mindset, because this country needed an enemy. And the women and children, well, they were property of the rich white males, and they couldn't vote. And the black man was property also, so they couldn't vote. Women belonged Poor white people belonged as serfs or serfdom in that thinking of it, and they were proper. They couldn't vote. They didn't have power.
Okay.
But then you had millions upon millions of native people. Let's not let them vote. Let's not let them vote, because that means there's going to be power here. So from that time, we were mentioned as far as being governed by commerce, and that the United States did have say in what they traded with other countries and whatnot. And that's in the
with
Constitution.
the Indian tribes,
yes.
right? Yeah.
And so they mentioned Indian nations within, and that was about it. And today that's still true, but as far as giving us freedom of religion, communal property, which we were used to sharing, that did not fit privatization and ownership, and monarchy especially, because as you see, this country still adores the King and Queen of England, yet it's a country that's not supposed to be upon those principles where everybody is inalienable and is treated equally. Well, it's not true with Native peoples even today. When you are an living evidence of that Constitution and the crimes committed against Native people such as myself, and knowing that, and being able to understand the inequalities, well, that's not going to be listened to, because that's the enemy talking to them. So for your 12-year-old, I say, look at what you're reaping as an American. And you really think in its ownership terms, you think about all Americans, any American, foreigners who come here want a piece of the American pie. Metaphorically, I say, if you want a piece of the American pie, just don't forget who owns the bakery.
This excerpt is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law, the leader of reform in legal education and a leader in multimedia education for the public. To view the full interview and for a full listing of MSL's programs, log on to mslaw.edu.